Hi everyone, we are live and this is the second day of a very important forum, a forum that will continue the discussion that we have started about democracy, a valuable element that we as DCN supported, responsible and open and transparent network, responsible and open and transparent society that we can trust upon. This is actually the main goals of this second day meeting, and I will pass immediately the floor to Aisha. Aisha, the floor is yours.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. So I'm Aisha Down. I'm a journalist. With me today, I have Alisher Siddiq, the director of RFERL Uzbek Service, Ingrid Omahna, a project coordinator for the Center of European Perspective, Grant Baker, a research associate at Freedom House, Pratik Sibal in UNESCO in Paris, Jan Mary Bagdasarian, legal fellow at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So all of us are here. Our panel today is about the negotiation between people and state power in an utterly new and vast territory. It's a complicated topic. It's tempting to draw conclusions or value judgments, e.g. technology apologists will like to say the internet enables freedom. We can circumvent oppressive regimes, and ultimately progress will lead to all the solutions we need. Others might point out that the internet has led to the erosion of trust, community, and democracy, leaving us more isolated and vulnerable. As a journalist, I'm drawn to concrete historical analogy. Maybe 700, 600 years ago, the technology to cross the ocean became mainstream. That means shipping. That technology, as it grew, became the conduit for all the world's trade, a means to evade state control, and an obscure industry controlled by a few untransparent powers and a lot of rogue players. That was 600 to 700 years ago, and we have not today succeeded in regulating the oceans. Most of us don't know what goes on there, and it's still a site of dangerous power games and flexing by the world's biggest countries. So with that, to explore how we are negotiating the new territory of people and power, I'll leave the floor to Alisher. Tell us what you do.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, I wanted to take it from where we left yesterday. So we left with the very Western, European problem of protecting personal data, of being very against social media, and that they're watching and like terrible people there. So but believe me, there was like 90% of the world is not thinking about these things. They're thinking about whether they will have social media, whether they will be able to open those, whether internet will not block. So these kind of things are the main headache in our part of the world. So I'm representing like all these kind of stands, let's say, as Uzbek director of Uzbek service of RFERL. So I can tell you, in Uzbekistan, this is, again, as I said, a different, completely different, let's say, story. Two weeks ago, government decided to shut down all social media and messengers. Why? Because authoritarian regimes say, I will protect your personal data. And they will just did it. They protected our personal data perfectly well. So that's why be careful what you wish for eventually. So in Kazakhstan, for example, government is chasing anyone who is writing comments, bad comments, and posting or liking. So that's a criminal charge. It's people are in jail for this. In Russia, the same. So freedom and internet is, internet and democracy for us is the same thing. It's what we think democracy is. When we have internet, we have democracy. So that's how we basically look at it. We are covering Uzbekistan. This is heavily authoritarian regime. Sitting in Prague, sitting like, I don't know, 4,000 miles away from the place where we're supposed to be, and because we're banned no free, independent journalists can work there. And imagine we are, if there's no internet or like freedom in Uzbekistan to get it, what would be the life for 35 million in that country? And how do we do that? We use technology, innovations, and first of all, we started thinking, out of box. Okay, what is news? Let's say news is something that is witnessed by journalists and reporters. Why, if you don't have journalists? Then, why, if you don't have journalists? Then it should be witnessed by people and reported by people. So that's how we came to the very strong belief that we need to engage people and empower people. And slowly building a largest network of citizen journalists, using all sorts of available messengers, social media, and now it is nearly 100,000 people in every corner, in every village, in every city, everywhere. It's like, it's a dream, because we don't have so many journalists. We wouldn't have so many journalists. We wouldn't be able to pay so many journalists. And now we just getting the torrent of information that is very difficult to manage, actually. It's very difficult to let every voice to be heard. So, but the system works like that, just now I was sitting, and the latest news was from a member of a party worker, basically, the party that belongs to the president. And just last month we had a presidential election, and again the same president won from that party. And this guy is writing to me, after we helped him to win presidency, we were working nights and days. Now they're cutting all of us. So imagine he says these things somewhere else inside the country. It's absolutely terrible. It could lead to absolutely terrible ramification for him. So, and that's why he's very free to open to write it to us. I just read it. I just already sent it to journalists to work on it. So we want to now know how many of these party members were cut, why, and just to show the whole cynical situation in the country. So simply to put it, empowering people using innovations, technology, enjoying freedom of internet, that's the kind of one big idea that we work for. And with that, I'll just pass.
No, just to clarify, so you have in every village in Uzbekistan basically built a network of people who can do the work of journalists secretly and safely because the regime is too oppressive otherwise for them to speak.
Absolutely. I mean, again, what is safety? Eventually, nothing is like 100% safe, we have like a very interesting situation when someone is reported on some big problem, then next day he's saying, like again typing and say, oh, everybody came here overnight. They were everyone. They were just searching for who reported on it, but at the same time fixing that problem too, and they doing like that, together. First idea, of course, to find. Second idea, of course, to fix, because in a bigger scale, I mean, we are American radio, American organization, and the truth usually in our society comes from from international media. Locally, you'll never get it. But it's also easy to authoritarian regime to say, hey, these are Americans, they're against us. Look, this is American propaganda. What we did, we just simply tweaked that and say, this is your people. Your people saying, why are you messing with Americans? Just listen what they say. And then it created very negative sort of, the impact of tiny report is much bigger than I would write the whole story about it, you know. So the impact of a mother who just saying, you know, what's the situation in the nurseries. Now, like right now, I got a message from the nursery that they haven't received their salaries for 6 months, and it's already out there. It's just reported right now. I'm sure if you don't trust me, tomorrow morning I'll show you, thank you, we got our salaries. That's how it works, you know. It's just very fast track, straightforward complaints, and they take it really seriously.
How long did it take you to build this network?
So,
It's a lot
of course, it's a lot of work, yeah. It's, the network is, it's not like you build it and it'll stay, yeah. It's, you know, in general, we're working on it for the past 10 years. We started from Skype, imagine. They had, like, the first thing was Skype. Radio Free Europe Uzbek service was kicked out from Uzbekistan because of our coverage of Andijan, the massacre of the government. And they thought, I mean, they, of course, accused us of instigating everything, but we ended up in Prague, they ended up in Uzbekistan, and there was nothing between us. And then there's a Skype, you know, like, and I said, yeah, that's the thing we should go for. And we started announcing the Skype, saying, type your complaints, talk to us. And, you know, in kind of a appearance of Skype immediately eased the, you know, the charges for international calls. And we all of a sudden became kind of a local, you know, you can call locally. And the interesting thing, what happened, of course, maybe it's not interesting for many people, but there are around 8 million labor migrants in Russia. And why Skype? Because it turned out that people in Uzbekistan, they were talking to their relatives via Skype. And it was like kind of a ready technology because they already had it and they just needed to redivert it to us. So that's how we started. And today, of course, it's Telegram, it's WhatsApp, and whatever new will come up, I mean, of course, that will be ours.
So you basically represent one really interesting and difficult example of how the internet can free people and can spread truth in very harsh circumstances. I want to now put you in conversation with Grant Baker here. Grant will talk about a recent Freedom House report, yes, on internet freedom, but I hope specifically addressing these issues and how the internet can make us, in some instances, far more free in extreme circumstances. So Grant, it's all you.
Thanks, Aisha. Can everyone hear me? Okay, this is my first time presenting with a mask and after the pandemic, so if you can't hear me, just yell at me. Anna, would you mind putting the PowerPoint up? Lovely. All right, so as Aisha mentioned, I'm going to be presenting on the findings from the Freedom on the Net report, which is an annual report that Freedom House publishes each year. But first, I want to take a moment to thank DCN for having us, Aisha for moderating, Alisher for the great introduction, and all of the panelists and participants who came here and have made this panel an event what it is. So, Anna, would you mind going to the next slide? I also want to thank the 80 analysts who help us cover internet freedom in 70 countries. So the way our report works is we work with people in different countries across the world who help us assess the state of internet freedom. And I also want to thank the internet freedom community more broadly, including many of you in the room. One of the reports I edit is the Uzbekistan report, and it just simply wouldn't be possible without reporting from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. It wouldn't be possible. We'd be missing the sources that we need. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the findings from the report, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the central theme of this year's report, which was on what we call the global drive to control big tech. And it's basically the idea that as, with these efforts to regulate the internet and kind of this burgeoning showdown between corporations and governments. Users are kind of getting left behind. And I think Alisher cited a great example at the beginning of his presentation with the recent blocking of social media platforms in Uzbekistan in response to a data protection law. Would you mind going to the next slide, Anna? So just briefly, we measure internet freedom in 70 countries, and we use kind of 3 categories. So obstacles to access, which is like internet shutdowns, the cost of internet, you know, that type of stuff. Limits on content, so what websites are blocked, et cetera. And then violations of user rights, so arrests, surveillance, you know, laws that facilitate surveillance, attacks on people who've posted online. Anna, would you mind? So from this year's report, we found that internet freedom declined for the 11th straight year. And the largest declines were in Myanmar, Belarus, and Uganda. Myanmar has declined by 14 points, which is actually the largest decline that we've ever observed. And that was largely in response to the coup and you know, the military shutting down the internet, blocking social media platforms, and attacking and arresting protesters. Belarus and Uganda also declined due to actions related to elections. There were mass arrests, large internet blocks, and large social media blocks. Ecuador and the Gambia were 2 of the countries that improved this year the most. So Ecuador improved by 5 points, which I'll talk about a bit later, and the Gambia improved by 4. As you can see, China remains the lowest ranked country, and Iceland remains the highest. Anna, would you mind just shifting to the next slide? So what we talk about, you know, when we talk about the global drive to control big tech is kind of the promise and peril of state regulation. And basically, you know, as we all know, and I think was discussed in the panel yesterday, over the past however many years, a small number of firms have come to control, you know, to have a ton of power in the online landscape. And that largely stems from, you know, the US took a very laissez-faire approach as these platforms grew and didn't make an effort to regulate them. But now we're seeing that kind of, in that lack of regulation, other countries are stepping in to fill the void, and that's not always in a positive way. So, you know, in some cases there are legitimate attempts to mitigate online harms and rein in surveillance and the abuse of data. But in a lot of other cases, you know, we see that these are actually, these regulations are abused to increase surveillance and increase censorship. So as you can see in this next slide, we kind of mapped out all the regulations in the 70 countries that we cover. So 48 out of the 70 countries had some sort of regulation, and 38 countries regulated content. So when we're talking about content, we're talking about, you know, what can get taken up and what can get taken down. So, you know, we've seen Germany's NetzDG laws being very influential, but recently we've seen more authoritarian governments, like Turkey, India. I mean, India is not authoritarian, but these governments take these broad approaches about what content can be taken up, taken down, and they don't have to go through a court. And, you know, it includes broad definitions of false information. Just recently, over the summer, Kyrgyzstan has also moved forward with a similar law that would require content, you know, that's quote unquote false to be taken down within 24 hours. And, you know, even in democratic countries, we've seen kind of these problems arise. The UK, France, and Australia have all introduced legislation that kind of broadly define online harms or illegal content and would pose threats to free expression. So we also found that 21 countries, you know, tried to regulate competition. And, you know, competition amongst these platforms is important. It can give users more control. It can better protect users' privacy. But in some cases, we've also seen that, you know, these competition measures are kind of just a mask to repress online platforms that people use. China, for example, took a number of measures this year. And then, you know, we also saw a bunch of, I up the numbers. It was 24 countries who tried to regulate content and 38 countries who tried to regulate data. So we had positive examples, like Ecuador, for example, adopted a very strong data protection law that resembles the GDPR and is great. But, you know, as Alisher said, in Uzbekistan, their countries have pursued data localization laws. Turkey as well, and these laws, you know, they require data to be stored in a certain country, and if that doesn't happen, then these platforms can be blocked, and if the data is stored there, then the government has more access, you know, to that data and can more easily surveil users. So could we go to the next slide? So just to wrap up here, we kind of tried, you know, sifting through this data to identify the best and worst practices for tech regulation. And really, you know, what we're thinking of broadly when we're thinking of best practices is how to prevent, you know, all of this power in the hands of the dominant players in the way that we currently have it. So, you know, we really feel that the democracies in this case need to lead the way in regulating and produce regulations that uphold freedom of expression online and protect, you know, users' rights to personal data. But we're concerned that in the absence of democracies taking these initiatives, we're also seeing measures that, you know, are deteriorating democracy, quite frankly. So, you know, that's what I have for you all, and thank you all for listening. And Aisha, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
So, Grant, I think this is, you know, you've done some great work here in talking about the negotiation between states and big tech on, I'd say, the key issues, right? Data protection and surveillance. I wonder, as someone who's researched basically internet freedom in the whole world, you know, people who are apologists for the internet would hold up examples like Alisher's and say, this is the potential of the internet. How often do you actually see successes like his? How often do you see user freedom present enough in these really oppressive regimes to really socially organize and create kind of powerful change against harsh circumstances?
I mean, I think it's hard. You know, it's a constant battle. People are constantly using online tools, whether they be, you know, messaging platforms or social media platforms, to organize. But in authoritarian countries, you're facing, you know, serious threats. So it's kind of this constant give and take. And I don't think, you know, we've seen the internet, of course, is not a totally liberating technology, right? We've seen authoritarians take advantage of the internet, either, you know, whether it's regulating platforms or just more directly, you know, using spyware to surveil dissidents. But we've also seen people continue to organize, whether it's, you know, the start of kind of it earlier in the past decade, where a lot more of it is taking place on large social media platforms, or now where we're seeing, you know, a lot more of the organizing, I think, across the world shift to messaging apps. I know people will talk about this later, but I think Belarus is also, you know, an example of a country where, you know, they face some of the harshest repression online, in terms of the internet being blocked, people being arrested for their posts, but at the same time, people move to private messengers and we're able to create communities. So I think it's, you know, it's hard to say like these are totally, I would not agree that these are totally liberating technologies, but I would not agree that, you know, they haven't played a role in kind of supporting democracy.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the Belarus more, because it was, you know, to how extent the, you know, these Telegram channels and internet helped to, you know, to mobilize, you know, these latest protests, for example, in Belarus, in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it was two things. One, the mobilization of the protests, and two, as the reaction to the protests, you know, it was when it was really bad and the internet was blocked and people were getting arrested. It also allowed people to continue to voice their opinions beyond that and continue organizing even in the face of, you know, really strong repression. And Belarus, is an interesting case. They have had a really, really strong tech community for a really long time. So that certainly helps with the transition like that. But yeah, it was, you know, a tool. It worked sometimes even when the internet was partially blocked, so that allowed people to kind of circumvent.
That's funny, because the same thing happens in Uzbekistan all the time, because even my grandma would know how to use VPN.
Yeah.
You know, and like immediately they do something and they like start doing, so VPN is working, and okay.
Your grandma knows how to use a VPN?
My mother knows how to use VPN. I mean, they're born with the ability to use VPN. They just like, it's a, VPN is the thing. And for example, another interesting case, when government blocked WhatsApp, the previous government, Telegram wasn't that popular. And in 2 days, all of those in WhatsApp moved to Telegram. And Telegram was nightmare for the government. I mean, they didn't know what they did, you know, I don't know. Someone must be hanged after this, because Telegram is much more opportunities with channels, and WhatsApp is nothing, basically, just Messenger.
So, I mean, I liked what, Grant, you said earlier, that a lot of users get left behind, and a lot of the questions that we research is a negotiation or the showdown between governments and big tech. And then, depending on the environment, maybe depending on the exact way something's regulated, you should tell us more, users can exploit or organize or carve out spaces for their freedom in this kind of environment of control and regulation that can be pernicious or not, and on the other hand, people wanting to just make them into a product and sell their data.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, you know, I think no matter the efforts to regulate, even in the worst cases, we're going to see users try and find a way, you know, to find new platforms in it. You know, in a lot of cases, we've seen this become a game of cat and mouse. And in Uzbekistan, you know, they block one platform, they block another, they restore access, they do it again. So I think even amidst the effort to regulate these companies, you know, users will find a way. But the concern is that, you know, some of these regulations that, you know, force companies to have in-country representatives that are liable for criminal prosecution, you know, which is like what we're seeing in Russia, in Kazakhstan, they might force companies to pull out from those countries, and then we're going to start to see a fragmentation of the internet, and then it's, you know, going to be harder for information to be transferred throughout the world. And that, again, that's not to say that all regulation is bad. There's a need for regulation, as we've seen, that, you know, takes into account freedom of expression and protects users' rights, because we also see a lot of really terrible, you know, hate speech and disinformation that has negatively impacted people and incited violence. So there's not, you know, it's a balance, and it's really hard to find that balance, and if anyone in this room had the answer, we'd probably be a lot richer.
Can I just, I'll try to be provocative a little bit, you know. I like these tech companies. I like Facebook. I love them, sorry. And yeah, these guys, you know, in Silicon Valley, they come up with some idea to make a lot of money, but they don't know what they're creating in the third worlds. You know, they topple regimes, you know, they don't care, they're just making money there. But here's Twitter revolution, Telegram, you know, nearly Telegram revolution, you know, in Russia now. Or YouTube in Russia, very powerful. And we're kind of looking now to Elon Musk. Again, the guy who wants to make a lot of money from his project Starlink. I mean, I was wondering whether, you know, Freedom House looks into this issue about Elon Musk's Starlink, whether internet will be so available and will completely wipe out autocratic regimes, you know.
Yeah, I can't really comment on that. I have not looked into it enough, to be perfectly honest, and I don't want to get up here and, you know,
you haven't met
I know, but I will say, just back to your earlier point about these tech companies topple regimes. Sure, in some cases, they've been parts of those movements, right? But there are two things. One, in some cases, that their roles have been kind of overstated, right? The classic example is Facebook in Egypt during the Arab Spring. You know, it was heralded across the world as this Facebook revolution, and for sure Facebook played a role. There were, you know, massive event pages on Facebook, but when it came to a lot of the organizing, it was still done through SMS, especially as the internet was restricted, and that kind of got downplayed in the narrative. And then, you know, also, these companies are bowing to, you know, authoritarian regimes more, right? You're talking about YouTube and Google in Russia. They've removed, you know, Navalny's smart voting app from the App Store at the behest of the Russian government. In Russia and Belarus, we've seen YouTube remove videos that are critical of the government, or at least block them in the country. So it's not, you know, again, these companies and the platforms they've built can be services to democracy, but they can also hinder democracy. And that's not even to touch on what I know we might talk about a bit later, some of the violence that they've instigated across the world. So I think, again, it would be nice if we could just say, you know, they are good or they are bad, but it's really a lot more murky and context dependent.
Well said. I'm going to bring in now Pratik Sidal at UNESCO. Pratik, can you tell us what you think of the discussion we've had so far, and introduce yourself and present, please? He's virtual. One note here too, everyone. I think there's going to be a series of questions as usual on Slido. They'll be polling you about your opinions, the internet and civic engagement. Listen to us and pay attention to our speakers, but answer those questions on the poll. We're interested in your thoughts. Pratik.
Yeah, can you hear me well?
Can't hear
okay.
you.
No? Okay, people online can hear me.
In the room, we need to hear Pratik.
Okay.
Speak now.
Do you hear me now? No? Should I join in parallel with Zoom? I don't know if that works better.
I think only we can hear you.
Well, let's have our own mini conference then.
Okay. We're getting there.
Can you hear? Okay, no worries.
Signal's got to come all the way from Paris, so bear with us.
That will kill you in radio for this outage.
Yeah. I used to read headlines on a
And
yeah.
Russians say policeman is born.
Okay. Yeah, so this is actually just a clever tactic to get rid of our minders. They've gone for a coffee break now. You can talk openly. How are we doing? Brief break. Okay. While they figure it out, I actually am going to move to Ingrid instead. That's fine with everyone. So I think Alisher and Grant. We good? Yeah. Okay. So far, Alisher and Grant, you've characterized the landscape where kind of opportunistic users, like partisans, can organize, create community, and maybe accomplish something really great. However, the giants are tech companies who are occasionally moral and governments who are occasionally moral, and they have a lot of the power. So, Ingrid, what do you do on the government side, and what's their perspective?
Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Ingrid Tomarna. I work at the Center for European Perspective, which is a governmental organization in Slovenia. It's a great pleasure to be here, so many thanks to DCN for having me. So yeah, we come from very different backgrounds, so I'm gonna share a very different perspective here. Of course, we want to learn from each other, but I feel like an outcast here, basically, because I'm gonna speak on behalf of like government side. So, but on behalf of democratic government side. So
We need you.
we need to emphasize that. So the emergence of inexpensive and accessible digital communication platforms, specifically social networks, represents a significant milestone in global interconnectivity. And the proliferation of digital communication media has completely democratized traditional information flow process. First, why? Because it reduced barriers to entry. While power to produce content was before in hands of the elite, everyone now has access to a mobile and basically professional production at their fingertips. Secondly, it empowered individuals to define their own information environment. They can now create and shape distribution networks according to their own preference, shifting away from hierarchical traditional methodologies and mechanisms. And of course, governments have struggled actually to adapt to this new information environment. So, because as I mentioned before, they were the ones who were basically producing and distributing a significant part of content that informed the people. And this power meant that little attention was focused on narrative competition. They have not invested in innovating new models that would kind of like create a closer relationship with their citizens, because they didn't have to. So, well, kind of like government's communications has like three primary functions. The first one is, of course, like to inform. The second one is to advocate, pursue. And the third one is to engage citizens. And of course, like governments, in many cases, they lack capacity in communication between government and the public. And one thing that is also very interesting, they also lack internal communication among like governmental agencies. Oftentimes, they don't realize, of course, that communication is a part of their job, and it's fundamental to their functioning. So, lack of communication budgets, secrecy laws, lack of kind of like elite will to share information, or the preference for communicating through state-owned media can be disincentives for government to develop communication capacities. So, government slowly adjusting to this digital realm has precipitated in a disconnect between citizens and institutions that represent them. And of course, this disconnect, this gap in between was identified by several actors that exploit the democratic nature of digital revolution by filling that gap with disinformation, which kind of like resonates in lack of trust in governments. So the reason why I have been telling you all this is that we, Center for European Perspective, in partnership with the US Department of State, we're kind of like actively encouraging governments to embrace the emerging art of 21st century statecraft. In 2017, we jointly developed the European Digital Diplomacy Exchange Program, which is an intergovernmental network of government communicators. committed to strengthen the capacities of countries to plan, coordinate, and prepare digital campaigns through various digital communication tools. We're kind of like offering them hands-on government-to-government digital strategic communications, guidance, training, and mentorship. And of course, the program is intended to empower them to counter threats in the information space and bolster their ability to engage with their own citizens with focus on accountability and transparency. So one thing that is very important to emphasize here is that we're taking this proactive approach for countering disinformation, which is kind of like mid to long-term strategic process, because the disinformation, in fact, requires a coherent, sustained response to create long-term change. So strategic narratives in relation to an issue need to be developed and asserted. So it means shaping it means shaping the information space to promote your own position and deter others. What is our main goal? Our main goal is equip them with tools, basically to be able to better communicate with their citizens, to better listen to their citizens, and of course to both embrace and protect their role within the context of this new democratized digital information environment. So we have already engaged more than 400 mid to high level government representatives from Western Balkans, Eastern Europe, and some European countries, Baltic states, Czech, Slovakia, and Bulgaria and Romania. So, which is also one benefit of this network is to kind of like to foster regional cooperation and coordination. So I have a question for the audience, if I may. Like,
Go for it.
How many of you can you actually say that that your governments kind of like communicate with you properly?
We got one.
Yes, please. Do you want to comment on that? Please.
Well, I suppose I'm from Ireland, and it was mentioned quite a lot yesterday, actually, about Ireland's history of using citizens' assemblies for decision making. I know as well there's been a real focus in the Irish government. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm saying there's still a long way to go, but there's been a really active focus throughout the pandemic to increase public communication and to create, definitely in terms of shaping policy for the next 20 to 30 years. There's been an initiative called the Shared Island Dialogue Unit. It comes from the Department of the Taoiseach. The Taoiseach is the leader of the Irish government, and it is basically channeling money into creating public forums for people to discuss major issues regarding like education, the economy. So they're actively trying to create space for citizen engagement and trying to directly shape policy. So between that and using citizens' assemblies and trying to have more public town halls, we're getting there. But I think that is because Ireland is in a major stage of flux and are trying to respond to external changes, and that's what they've been trying to do to adapt. So I feel quite fortunate to be in a country where I do feel that attempts are being made, even if they aren't perfect. But yeah, that's us so far.
So, one of the conversations Ingrid and I have had is about how the failures of government communication, basically if you're too slow, or if you're kind of not clear enough, or if your statement doesn't communicate can lead to distrust. Journalists won't, for example, use that statement, or it might not come out in time, and whatever is in the gap is what leads to disinformation. Am I characterizing that correctly?
Yes, in a way.
So I want to put you now in conversation with Mary, a fellow at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Mary, I want you to talk to us about your research into government bills to combat disinformation and how gaps in government communication lead to it, promote it, or how governments opportunistically use the fact of disinformation to further control their citizens. Mary.
Sure. Can you hear me?
You're here.
Okay, I guess you can hear me. I hope so. Um, okay, based on your reaction, I believe you can hear me. So first, I wanted to say thank you very much for having me, and I'm super happy to see this event at my homeland. Huge thanks to DCN for organizing this event on such important topics. So I believe what I'm going to share is going to tie perfectly with what was discussed by Grant and Ingrid and Alisher, because to tie back to the discussion, I would say that I believe that big tech companies didn't really realize what they were getting into when they started their businesses, but at the end, they turned into platforms that allowed for more than maybe was envisioned in the beginning. And as any forum, again, we see the same issues as we see in real life, but more exacerbated online. And one of the issues, as Ingrid was telling us with their approach in Slovenia, is tackling disinformation, which turned into a huge problem, especially during the pandemic. But in the context of my research that I did a few months ago, for the Open Internet for Democracy Leaders program, I researched disinformation bills in my home country, Armenia, where we are hosted now. And basically, to give you a bit of context, last fall, Armenia was battling the second Nagorno-Karabakh war, when the decades-long conflict with our neighbor Azerbaijan reignited once again. But at the same time, the country was battling an online misinformation, disinformation war. And for instance, Facebook declared and acknowledged in its report that it took down Azerbaijani networks for coordinated inauthentic behavior, meaning that these are accounts and groups or just pages that are misleading with regards to who they are and what they are tied to. In this case, the accounts were posted primarily in Azerbaijani, but also in Russian and English, and discussed domestic and regional developments, including the ones relating to the conflict. Regardless of the fact that Facebook took this down, later in April 2020, The Guardian actually uncovered that this network was back on Facebook once again. So again, against this backdrop of this background, the government decided to, actually the parliament, a few MEPs from the ruling party decided to introduce a few bills that were declared to be tackling disinformation online. So one of those actually regarded some additional obligations for journalists. So, for instance, unlike countries like Brazil that introduced its fake news bill and put more obligations to fight disinformation on messaging apps, in this case, the government decided to put more obligations on the journalists. And so this bill expressly prohibits journalists from using online sources that cannot be identified. The initial bill actually mentioned anonymous sources, which caused a lot of confusion and a lot of debate from this civil society, because using anonymous sources is one of the pillars of any journalistic activity. So prohibiting using online anonymous sources would be a huge blow to media freedom in the country. And after series of discussions, the term was changed to unidentified sources, and now the bill is back to the parliament for the process of being adopted. And the bill proponents actually argued that the spread of disinformation from unknown sources poses national security risks, and actually most of this concerned messaging platforms such as Telegram or WhatsApp. So in fact, they decided that rather than going after these platforms to do a better job of fighting disinformation, they are going to put more obligations on journalists to verify their sources, or not to post anything, not to report on anything that they got from an anonymous source online that they cannot verify um, who this source is in real life. Um, you know, this is a chilling effect in action, and I'm following the discussions in the parliament, but we'll see if this will be adopted or not eventually. The second bill was introduced and adopted in March 2020, and with this bill, amendments to the civil code tripled the financial penalty for defamation and insult. And again, huge criticism from civil society and the Ombudsman's office. And as a result of this, President Armen Sarkisian decided not to sign this law and send it to Constitutional Court for review. However, in October 2021, the court actually declared these amendments constitutional, and then these amendments were signed into law. I would say that this has direct effect on media freedom in the country because, as Reporters Without Borders reported last year, actually these provisions in the Civil Code are used a lot by politicians to go after media that they want to silence. So we see that tripling financial penalties is going to have a direct hit on media organizations in the country. And finally, the third bill, again proposed by the ruling party, included changes to the criminal code, and it imposes strict penalties up to even potential imprisonment for deliberately spreading false information using a pseudonym, or defamation or insult using a pseudonym. And I would add that there is a specific provision in this new article in the criminal code that actually refers to insulting public officials, which goes in direct contradiction to the international human rights standards, when public officials should be subject to higher public scrutiny, not the other way around. And in this case, again, national security was cited as one of the reasons to criminalize insult, and again, chilling effect on free speech in action. And already we see instances of this provision being practiced by the law enforcement against people who posted comments against the prime minister on Facebook, and these cases are still under investigation. And as I said, a lot of civil society organizations expressed concern, including Freedom House, and as I mentioned, high fines for defamation and insult, unclear definition for unidentified sources in the law, or too much focus on public officials and insult are very alarming signs that these bills need to be reversed, and generally criminalizing insult, generally criminalizing any form of speech is considered to be a chilling effect on free expression under international standards. And I would say that this may not have had any direct impact on Armenia's status under Freedom House's Freedom on the Net report, because it was still declared to be a free. But I assume that if we continue in this way, we will see potential decline in the democratic status, because I believe in huge force for media as a public watchdog. So some bad news for me, but I think this was an interesting example when the government tried to fight disinformation, which is a very noble goal, very important, especially given Armenia's context. But the solution requires more scrutiny and got a lot of criticism, I would say.
Bring in here a question from our audience, and audience is free to ask questions on Slido or in person. You can raise your hand. But Ingrid and Mary, I'd like you to maybe answer this on both government side and the user side, but we have a question basically civic engagement and digital competency, civic engagement and digital competencies, to what extent is the one a requirement for another? So I think we'll go with where have, for example, on the government level, digital competencies or a lack of digital competency, how does that screw up civic engagement?
Okay.
Go.
Okay. So if I understood the question correctly, I mean, from the government side, the problem is if we go from here that like government communicators
Yes.
lack digital skills, digital competencies, and that is a huge problem.
Your job is to train government
Exactly.
communicators.
Exactly.
Where does it go wrong?
It goes wrong from the very beginning, like who these people are, basically, because they get employed like without any experience whatsoever. That's one thing, and the other thing is that basically the leadership is still kind of like, if you look at it, like extremely traditionally oriented, and they basically don't see the needs. They don't see the need to communicate with, like directly with citizens, because now we have, what we see is like a two-way communication. It's no longer like one way. So, and there is of course a lack of like money, as I mentioned before, lack of training, lack of everything. So then we have what we have. Another thing that is also very, very important is a clearance process. So basically everything, that, when you're communicating via social media, you need to be fast. So it's like, that is a huge problem. So if you're waiting for clearances, I mean, there's no way. Something's gonna come out before that. And basically you're gonna need to kind of like mitigate that risk, what happened, so.
So, Mary and Ingrid, would you say that on the government side, the government, when it comes to digital competencies, are great at taking measures to, or trying to take measures to exert control, but not good at stepping into the space and speaking their position and engaging, putting themselves out there?
Okay, very honestly, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so. The only thing that they are, like, the way, at least with the governments that I work with. So I have to say that they are all kind of like trying really hard to get better at this. And the thing is, the thing is that, of course, as we see, like, for instance, like the fight against disinformation is not only the responsibility of governments, but we need this like whole of society approach, which means that we need to have literate citizens. So media literacy is very important. Like, we need to cooperate like with journalists. So it's a bit, let's say, it's a multi-layer problem. So, and I don't see like, basically kind of like a demand for citizens to be like digitally savvy, like, I mean, yeah, but media literacy is something that everyone's kind of like interested in.
Okay, great. I'm being told by our organizers here that I should let our audience have a 5-minute break. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll come back. We'll talk more about disinformation and how governments promote it or use it as an excuse to crack down on journalists, and then we'll bring Pratik into the conversation. So 5 minutes, everyone. Hello. All right, we're back. Are we back? Stream good? Coffee obtained? We're happy? Okay, so, to this point, again, me with my concrete journalistic metaphors, we've been characterizing this new territory. Users on this territory, they're good at coming up with a new way to organize every week, and whatever kind of control or difficulty you put in their way, they often can find a way around it. And if they're motivated, and if they have kind of community power, can create spaces of freedom. They're good at that. Governments operate in a different way. Ingrid's been talking to us about that. They are institutions that move slowly, and they might not, make it to the punch fast enough to communicate their truth, leading to distrust and an information gap. They have some other issues. Ingrid's talked about that, and maybe should comment more, that make them very different players in the landscape than users. Yeah? If you want to comment more on that.
I missed that. Sorry, Aisha.
Sorry about that. My bad. So governments act differently
Yes.
than users in the landscapes of the internet. You train government communicators. What you told us kind of before the break is it's hard for them to build trust. It's hard for them to act with information. In your experience training government communicators, what's been the hardest thing for them to learn?
This is really hard to comment on because I mean, to some extent they have some kind of knowledge, of course, but it's sometimes really hard to actually do that in practice. So this is actually what I think. It's not so hard to learn. The hardest part is basically to implement what you've learned in your own country. Because as I said, we're training basically government communicators, practitioners. We're rarely training leadership. So this is the hardest part because it needs to be this bottom-up approach, which is, sometimes maybe a problem of authority. And, it's really hard to do that.
So it's as much about will as about tools.
Yeah, but still, I think, people here in this sector, actually move pretty quickly. They change positions. So in my opinion is the more people we train, I mean, those people are sometime, gonna be in those kind of high-level positions. So they're gonna have that influence. So they kind of know what's important. Mm-hmm. And there's gonna be a change. But as I said, this is a very long-term process. This doesn't happen through night. And the way governments, for instance, for disinformation especially, the thing is that they are trying to prevent that very quickly. But the thing is once this information is out, the damage has been done. You can try to debunk it, do whatever you want to do, but it's there. So the problem is, so also what Mary basically mentioned, is that they're trying to kind of as far as I understood, I had difficulties hearing you, I'm sorry, but as far as I've heard, that the country is trying to prosecute journalists for that. So this is kind of an instant solution, but it's not going to go anywhere. So what they need is this long-term approach, but they are impatient, of course they are.
So I think that really speaks well, in a way, to what Mary was talking about, and I'd like Mary in a couple seconds. Hi there. Thank you. It's so early in San Francisco. It must be miserable for you. We love having you here. So for governments to learn to act well in this space, you're talking about almost institutional level change. What governments can do now and are doing now is something often more pernicious. They might not know how to put out their position or negotiate their position with journalists in a way that the journalists will listen and disinformation won't propagate. So instead, they do what they can do, which is almost in a way be gatekeepers and punish people for spreading disinformation or just because they want to punish them. Mary, you were talking to it, I know you have a lot more kind of subtlety and nuance than what I've just said, but about how the government in Armenia has opportunistically used disinformation bills to basically prevent journalists from using a lot of what would be their normal sources and doing their normal job. Is that right?
So I hope you can hear me better now. So
We
actually
hear you.
that bill is still, I'm just hearing myself in the echo. That's why it's taking a second. Okay, so going back to your question, I would say that this is something in the making. So this bill about unidentified sources is actually in the parliament at the moment. And from the looks of it, it seems that this, though, as I mentioned, there are significant drawbacks and potential chilling effects regarding this bill. But I would like to comment on something that Ingrid said and actually tie it back to the question from the audience before the break. So I agree with Ingrid so much. The governments are actually trying to find fast, quick, and easy solution to this information, which is not there. And this actually ties back to the digital issue. So let's consider all this information around COVID that all the countries, almost all the countries in the world are struggling with right now. Taking the example of my country, Armenian government, in my opinion, hasn't done much to fight against this misinformation in the country. And there were even colloquial conversations among Armenians that it's better to just shut down Facebook for some time in Armenia, not to have everyone read all the misinformation around vaccines and COVID and anything related to the pandemic, because it was out of hand. The situation was uncontrollable. This, of course, has real life consequences. And whatever the government tries to do right now in terms of raising awareness is not going to go far, because, as Ingrid mentioned, it should take time. It's going to take time. But with COVID, as we saw in almost all countries, it's impossible to reach any quick results. But in my opinion, it's the best solution is to start investing in this now. So we will fight with this a lot along the way. We'll see a lot of bad situations and bad results and not sound solutions from the governments, but I would say it's better to start now to invest only about this information. But this goes to cyber attacks, data breaches, and loss of personal data for millions of people due to their lack of knowledge on how to be a more cyber hygiene and situations like this. So answering to the question from the audience, I would say there is a direct connection between civic engagement and digital literacy, but both take a lot of time. So to have functioning and vibrant and participatory democracy in the 21st century with all these online platforms and tools and having another medium of communication, I think it's going to take a lot of work from all the governments. And just looking at the examples from the Nordic countries, when everybody studies media literacy at school, we don't see that many cases with misinformation these days. And that could be a real life example of why it is important to invest in digital literacy and find trying to silence journalists or put more obligations on their shoulders these days.
Really well said. And I'm struck by what you said a few minutes ago, that disinformation was so wildly out of control that actually people in Armenia, not just the government, were saying just shut Facebook down. That's pretty dramatic. But maybe it speaks really well to what we're saying, the availability of tools for for governments who aren't users to move in this space is not there yet, it sounds like, and a long process. At this moment, we have an audience sitting patiently here. We just want to ask if there's any questions or anything anyone wants to say before I now bring in Pratik and move the discussion.
Can I just ask Mary one thing?
Please do.
I only have a question, because we have basically a similar situation in Slovenia, kind of. So they introduced like a similar law, as you mentioned, like to basically punish those who kind of like insult public officials. So we have the same thing in place at the moment. But what I wanted to hear from you is like, what was like, in your opinion, like, the whole government strategic communication? Like, did you think that this, like, during the COVID period, how was that? Was that like okay, in your opinion, or was it like, were they communicating badly with like the citizens? Like, were they informing the citizens about the virus? Well, did they like include like the experts?
Great question, Ingrid, actually. I will answer this in from two different perspectives. So for the law, I think it was not about COVID, but it was about the post-conflict, post-armed conflict situation in the country when there was no trust, and it's still debatable where there is trust for this government after the results of the armed conflict. It felt that under the disguise of fighting disinformation or just citing the reasons of national security, they decided to fight against fake profiles online and include a specific provision that if you insult a public official using a fake profile, then you get criminal penalties. I think this was very tragic use of the situation to silence the dissent in the society potentially. But to your question on disinformation on COVID particularly, I would say that in the beginning there was no communication. Then there was just communication about all the restrictive measures, and later I would say in general it was too little, too late. And because our population is very opinionated, I think the government should have started way earlier than when they did or tried to do anything with this regard, because you need data to fight any other opinion about COVID or the vaccines. And this is super hard even right now because we have different forms of vaccines, but people have questions, and even doctors sometimes cannot answer this. So it will be years of research to answer every single detail about the vaccine, and the governments don't have this time to do this. So instead of trying to explain some things that are known already, they were like silent on a lot of the things that were known already or were verified by the WHO, let's say. But I also want to just bring another factor into the discussion when we deal with governments. I think we sometimes forget that government consists of people, and as with COVID, even doctors are not united in their opinion about the vaccines. So sometimes we forget that people that work in the government also are people and might also have their own personal opinions. And in different countries, when you have well-established institutions, you do not think about this at all because the institution just operates the same way regardless of who is there. But in some other countries, people matter. So I think in countries like Armenia, that might be the case when the government itself was conflicted as to what is the reality, to be able to properly communicate this to the public.
All right. I see we have some audience questions, and I want to ask those, but I actually want to move to Pratik next, so we can get his perspective in before we have a free-for-all and start throwing chairs at each other. Kidding, don't throw chairs. All right, so Pratik, you here, you ready? Pratik at UNESCO is going to speak to us now that we've discussed kind of the actors of users and government in this space, actually about how populist politics has led to shrinking space for civic engagement, and how kind of the movements of today affect and may determine the direction of what we've discussed so far. So can I have Pratik?
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Aisha. Can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So I do hear a bit of echo, but I think now it's okay. So thank you so much. It's great to be part of such a multi-stakeholder dialogue, and it was great to listen to all of you this morning. Um, I would love to respond also to the discussion between Ingrid and Mary, but perhaps I'll come to that later on governments. What I've been noticing is that we're focusing too much on internet versus democracy, and we've taken a bit of a deterministic view of technology. We go ahead and say that internet either can be for the good or can be for the bad. It's for democracy or it's against democracy. But like any other technology, I think we should be a bit mindful of being too deterministic about it. In my view, technology is laden with scripts, and this is probably I should clarify, this is not just my view. In science and technology studies, this is a long held understanding that technology is not neutral, it is laden with scripts. So if you just to give you a short example, if you are driving your car and you see a speed breaker, you slow down. It's because the speed breaker as a technology is laden with a script, which when you see it, you act based on how it would determine your behavior to be. So similarly, I think when we talk about technology platforms, we should be also ascribing responsibility to the designers of these platforms in terms of the scripts that they're are imbuing in these technologies. So if you are talking about privacy, or whether algorithms are privileging content which is causing more disruption and division because it feeds well into their financial model, uh, this is where we need the conversation around value sensitive design, which brings me to my second point, which is around democracy and what are the values in democracy. Can we think about the values that inform democracy, whether it's equality or freedom, and then think about technology and say, yes, these are the values that are important for democracy and for rule of law, and we need to imbue our technologies with these values which can then promote democracy. So the discussion about versus or for, I think, is a bit more detailed uh, than just that. So I'll stop here on that point, but I wanted to move to the other point, which is around populism. We've been talking about internet versus democracy, but we've not really talked so much about democracy. We've talked about authoritarian regimes, but in democracies as well, if you were to say a democracy as having elections every 4 or 5 years, having a smooth transfer of power, the space for civic discourse is shrinking. We've talked about disinformation. Uh, but we need to understand that populism as a mechanism is is built on this idea that there is the leader, and the leader represents the real people, and whatever that real people may be, it is supposed to be a homogeneous group of people. So when in the beginning Alisher pointed out that if you are a US based organization, the government or may say that, oh, you are an outsider and hence your interests don't align, you are not our people, and hence you bring our people. But this itself is antithetical to the idea of democracy, because in democracy, you need equality. You cannot have a leader who goes and talks about, you are not our people, or our conception of what people should be, because this is where we start moving away from democracy. You delegitimize a certain section or group of population, and this is happening and ties in well with the discussion around journalists that we are having. In a lot of countries, journalists are called names, or journalists have been uh, have been considered as anti-nationals and so on. So this process of delegitimization is part of the wider move towards populism. We've talked in the Freedom House discussion, we've talked a bit about different countries, but we've talked about the top ones, which are perhaps autocratic regimes. But what about the others which are below? So I think the discourse about democracy and internet, we need to be alive to the challenge of populism and how it supports and delegitimizes different forms of expression. To give you one example before I stop, uh, if you are online uh, and you as a civic minded citizen want to engage with politicians or in a political debate, uh, people are not going to engage with your argument. People are engaging with who you are, why you are taking a view which is not considered as belonging to this homogeneous group of real people, or real patriots or nationals, uh, and would delegitimize your argument. So this is where we are breaking from democracy, where in the traditional Habermasian sense, we would have discourse and based on rational arguments and then arrive at a common understanding, which will then feed into the public sphere, the policy sphere. So I think we need to be watchful of this trend. Some solutions and that have been proposed is to work on the infrastructure of democracy, and this is a political philosopher Jan Werner Müller, who talks about, and this is not new, on political parties and media and how they need to be strengthened to create that space for discourse. And I'll stop here.
Some really important elements here, and you introduced a lot, so I'm gonna back up a little bit. That point you made about how I mean, we see now these debates about algorithms, right? Social media algorithms drive rage or certain kinds of engagement, but that's a great question to ask. What would a democratic script look like? What is an internal script inside any kind of these large platforms? What does a democratic script look like? And sometimes, to me, it seems almost antithetical to the design, because I don't know, if I were a social media platform, I'd probably want everyone to look at mostly the same thing, and I'd want to drive them in a certain direction, and the nuance and variety and occasional fragmentation of democratic engagement is pretty hard to capture, wouldn't you say?
So, um, I'll just chime in, and to other panelists and audience, please feel free to chime in as well. So here, I think pluralism is important in a democracy within institutions, and similarly on social media, I think we need to encourage pluralism. Now, this is also to mention that not happen. For instance, when you talk about internet browsers, you have certain internet browsers which have privacy by design, which have privacy as a default. So, so I think it really depends on what is the constituency arguing for these scripts to be laden in technology. Now, when we talk about social media algorithms, uh, I think there is a need for us to push for instance, when we talk about regulation, um, what are we talking about? What is it that we want to regulate? We reach out to all kinds of ideas which lead us to banning and stopping spread of information and so on, which is not the solution at all. It hurts free expression if we just end up deplatforming people or just stopping the platform itself. What we need is to design technology in a way that facilitates dialogue. Now, what that could entail is you have algorithms which facilitate conversation, which show you content which is not traditionally based on your own view, but could be someone else's, so you don't fall into echo chambers or filter bubbles. So I think this is where we need to think more. One way could be to start with to have more transparency as to what are these algorithms doing? We don't necessarily know. We know projects which were academic projects which were trying to understand how social media algorithms work. They were threatened with their funding cut down or with lawsuits against them. So as a first step, we need to open up the space. We need to open up how these algorithms work. What are the consequences? We've seen so much with the investigations going on with Facebook that people inside know how divisive their content can be and how divisive their algorithms are. We need to make it public, we need to understand, and then start working on value sensitive design, which links with democratic values of pluralism, of equality, of encouraging freedom, of encouraging dialogue. Yeah.
Fine. Um, okay, I think that's a very interesting point, and that almost characterizes the third pillar of the triangle in this space. If we have government and we have users, now we also have the challenge of actually creating any kind of big tech that could promote democracy instead of populism. I want to, at this point, bring in the people in the room. Do I have questions? I know I have some online questions. Do I have questions here? People want to say anything. You want to say something. What's your name? Let me give you a mic.
My name is Halid Aidini. I'm from North Macedonia. I am economist. I'm working a long time like a manager. Yeah. I like to speak about the democracy short, about truth. And I think, and government, I think every government like to share his truth. But our mission, like a society, like a journalist, is to not believe everything what they say. Because they always share half truth. Because no government can do everything what the people need. And so we have a very good example. Just last time, the government of Austria lied a long time, but the public opinion in Austria, journalists, the chancellor and deputy chancellor share a lie about the work of the government, and the people now, they have meet with oligarchs about if they win election, will sell half of Austria on one newspaper. And the journalist is working hard to tell the truth to the people. And now we have the Chancellor Kurz resigned, the Vice President Chancellor Scholz have problem with the law. So we encourage to the society not to take granted the democracy, because the democracy is not star in the tree. The democracy is to participate. So if everyone do the things, our society will be a little bit better, and the democracy will be growing up. We need it, everyone, because I say the democracy is the most democratic system that we have. The truth, you know, the truth in the internet is, I think, we can cover with a proverb. I think it's everywhere, but we in Balkan, we use much. Not everything that's flying you can eat. And not everything what is published in the internet is the truth. We have too much disinformation, and we have so less people who can educate the people what they can read, what is the truth, what is half truth. So I think the institution and the other public opinions can do a little bit more about educate the people what is good and what maybe can be bad for him.
Speakers, do you have any comment on that? Do I have any questions from our audience? Yulia.
Thanks a lot. Just a quick question for Grant, probably regarding the Freedom House report on freedom on like internet, and we saw that Ukraine is like partially free in terms of internet freedom. And as far as I understand the methodology right and all the findings, one blogger was arrested, a YouTuber. It is true, but like if to go in depth, this blogger was had a YouTube channel and spreading Russian propaganda, calling for Putin to come back to Ukraine. And my question is, where is the border line between freedom of speech in the internet and some threats to sovereignty, which is prescribed by law, actually? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. So just a few points on Ukraine's ranking. And to start with your question specifically. Oh. Sorry, is this better? Yeah. So the indicator where we measure arrests is C3, and we actually improved that score this year because, as you mentioned, there was the one YouTuber, and what I think is, yeah, that's not content that is necessarily, critical to a democracy or protected under international human rights standards if you're calling for almost an invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, arresting people is not the right way to silence this content. And what was really at the heart of some of the lower scores in previous years in that section is the state security units kind of continued practice of arresting Russian agents without providing really much information about who they were. And maybe they are Russian agents, maybe they're not. It's really hard to tell, and that opacity was part of the reason that the score had been low, and the fact that those were resulting in people being punished, right? Which happened a lot less this year. The problem that we see in Ukraine, that's also kind of a similar issue here, is the blocking of the Russian platforms, right? Which President Zelensky said when he was on the campaign trail, it was something he was against, but since he's been in office, it's actually expanded. And again, we understand that some of these services are connected to problematic oligarchs and all of that stuff, but they also provide people with ways to communicate. So it's finding this balance and not kind of, restricting people from these services, or in the case of arrests, sentencing people and leading to which can lead to a chilling effect for their speech online. So it's not that, that we think this speech is good or anything like that. It's about the broader ramifications that these decisions can have. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, thank you. That was a really great question.
Do we have other questions? Yes. Tell us your name.
Thank you. My name is Balázs Pinter from Hungary. Actually, I would like to have a question regarding government communication, but first let me tell a little story which will eventually lead up to my question. So basically what happened in my home country in Hungary in the summer after being in lockdown due to the pandemic is that the government was trying to get the public's opinion on how to restart the economy. So they basically published a form where you can tell your opinion. Now the problem with that was that the authentication process for filling out the form only required you to give an email address, which you received a confirmation link for. Now what happened is that a person was able to write a Python script with the use of Selenium to automate the script, to automate the filling process, the fill out process. So what he did was basically filling out forms and live streaming online, and filling out forms like if I remember correctly, 10 forms every minute, which is definitely a problem because obviously the information the government got from those forms were false and did not represent the public's opinion. Now, what I would like to ask about this is that how common of a practice it is for governments to ask for cybersecurity experts' opinion before any online interaction.
I'm afraid I cannot answer that question. I don't, yeah. I mean, the thing is that we don't work with them like in the field of cybersecurity, really. It's more like maybe hybrid threats, which is like, you know, a broader concept. But like, I'm sorry. I mean, if anyone can help with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can take a stab at this. I think in kind of sidestepping your question, in the case of Hungary, I don't think the government cares. You know, the national consultation, so which is what you're talking about, where they ask kind of these leading questions that are meant to confirm their beliefs. There's no transparent process about how people answer, which was why this was such a big scandal, because this guy posted a YouTube video showing him just filling out responses and filling out responses. And then what the government has done in the past with these national consultations is they use the results to justify future policy. So they'll ask, like, you know, is migration into Hungary bad? And they'll say, oh, so many people said no. And this guy kind of exposed the farce of it all. So I think, you know, in some cases we do see cybersecurity experts consulted, but I think in some cases governments aren't really interested, and they're interested in these kind of, quote unquote, their online tools as a way to reinforce their own beliefs.
Thanks very much. Got another question from the audience here online. It says, what gives us, the democratic West, the right to interfere in authoritarian countries' regimes and undermine their processes of regulating the internet? As an American living in the Middle East, I love this question, but I'm gonna reframe it a little bit because I don't want to go down a politics rabbit hole. I want to ask, how much is the fact that most of these big internet platforms are Western and based in the West, can that introduce, Alisher, Grant, Mary, Pratik, valid sovereignty issues? We talk about authoritarian regimes using excuses to persecute journalists, but there might be valid sovereignty issues here. And then if we talk about the democratic West interfering, what actually is in the power of the democratic West to do about these authoritarian regimes, and is it a good and fair idea or not? Alisher, you first.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I don't think there's anyone who fought so much with Facebook. I mean, of course, and YouTube's as I did, and tried to get our message to them through multiple channels, including government and everything. So the problem was, you know, and even with misinformation. So these platforms open equal opportunity to everybody. So that's a big problem. And for example, my organization is US government, almost semi-government organization, has to pay to Facebook for promotion, right? And so does Putin. And they equal on the same platform. So the problem, since I'm coming from traditional media, yeah, you know, governments would control radio waves, you know, there would be radio, there would be satellite, you need to ask permission. Journalists were kind of chilled. They know they're addressing certain audience, you know, authority. If it is newspaper, you need to be really clever guy to write to newspaper. You need to find the envelope, write the letter, put an envelope, and that means you're already cool and like you already have some intellect. Now with social media, you know, anyone can write. That's very big problem. That's why you have so much stupidity. It doesn't, you know, it's okay, yeah. So, and these platforms became kind of completely changed the whole world for us as journalists, because now we don't own the agenda anymore. So the agenda is not ours. It may be some influencer, some kind of a very well promoted by money kind of a fake channel. I don't know, Russia Today, you mean it, you name it. So you can, there could be something else. But these platforms, for example, none of these platforms, if you look at it, maybe I'm wrong, but if you open like Facebook or YouTube, would it immediately lead you to the whitelisted good information, latest news, good news about like vaccine? No, it will, the first thing that will pop up will be the stupidest thing, then you know, it depends on how you search. So all these algorithms are really messing up with the truth in the world, you know. And so that's kind of my point. And they refused to whitelist us. We are like we are treated the same way as anyone else on YouTube. I mean, if they strike us on us, they do everything they want, basically. So what can we do? Now we are no longer exclusive owners of agenda, of distribution channels, and we sort of gave everything to social media giants, in a way.
I mean, the question of sovereignty issues is really hard. We're talking about platforms that are based largely in the West, right? And it seems to me that authoritarian regimes would opportunistically say, well, these are, you know, tools of the Americans or those who seek to undermine us or whatever. And, you know, they might not be right, but they might not be wrong either. And yet then we can also fairly criticize them for censoring or using the platform, maybe we can, to spread hate speech. So sovereignty seems to me to be kind of a really prickly thing here. What do you think, Grant?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really a tough question, obviously. And, you know, we've seen a move towards digital sovereignty and cyber sovereignty in a number of countries over the past few years. But I guess I'd want to start from the point that, you know, there are democracies that aren't in the West as well. So what we're calling for, like when we're asking for stronger and better regulation, is not just in Western democracies. So that's one facet. I think another facet too is these companies are US based, but their user bases has become so wide. I mean, and it was intentional. You know, Facebook's Free Basics program famously has made it the de facto internet in a number of countries. So you've built this dependence on the platform. And then I think, you know, we're talking about trying to preserve a global internet where information can be shared and people are connected. And I do think, Aisha, you were kind of getting to part of the point. And part of the issue is, you know, authoritarians in some of these cases, they do have a point. You know, like when Putin blocks Twitter for, you know, what he calls prohibited content, what he focuses on is, and sorry, this happened in March 2021 because Twitter refused to remove prohibited content. He focuses on, like, you know, their videos of kids committing suicide, and like those aren't getting removed, and that's a legitimate problem, you know. But what they're also banning are quote unquote minors, which often extends beyond that, at protests in support of, you know, Navalny and the political opposition. So it's kind of, the thing is that this, you know, lack of regulatory action in democracies, both in the West and not in the West, has created this space for other governments, or frankly, regulatory actions taken by the West that can be mimicked by more authoritarian governments to create a less free internet. So in terms of what right do Western governments have, I think that's a really tough question, but I think we as civil society, whether in the West or not in the West, you know, should push these platforms to take decisions that uphold human rights everywhere. Yeah, I think that's where I stand.
I think that's really well said. I'm getting told that it's time for me to let y'all go to lunch, so I'm going to do that. Thanks everyone for being here.